The morning of the fete dawned with an almost unnatural cheerfulness, the kind that often precedes the most tragic of human follies. Street, Mary Mead, with its clipped hedgerows and the faint chime of the church clock, appeared as tranquil as ever. Yet beneath that quiet English surface, tensions small and unspoken fluttered like trapped birds. The villagers were gathering on the green, setting out tables laden with sponge cakes, preserves, and handmade crafts for the annual summer health fair, organized by none other than Dr. Leonard March, the town's recently arrived physician. He was a tall, composed man in his 40s with a calm voice and the unsettling gift of remembering everyone's ailments as if catalogued in some private ledger. The townsfolk admired him. Some, like Mrs. Bantry, declared him a godsend after poor Dr. Hayward's passing. Others, like Mrs. Price Ridley, whispered that no man so quiet could be entirely straightforward. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the tea tent, watched all of this with her usual gentle patience. She wore her lilac shawl despite the warmth, a cup of weak tea beside her, and her pale eyes moved across the green with the serene curiosity of someone accustomed to noticing what others dismissed. She had already observed that Dr. March's smile tightened whenever Mrs. Temple approached him, that young Molly Briggs's laughter faltered when her father mentioned the doctor's new prescription, and that the vicar's wife, dear Mrs. Clement, seemed uncharacteristically tense, her hand lingering too long on a leaflet titled The Healing Power of Silence. Miss Marple had learned long ago that in a small village, silence was seldom a virtue. It was a signal, a veil drawn too quickly over something uncomfortable. The fair was halfway through when it happened. The brass band had just struck up a tune from The Merry Widow, and children were racing about with paper flags when a sudden cry sliced through the chatter. Miss Hartwell, the postmistress, stood near the tent where Dr. March had been giving health consultations. Her face had gone grey as she pointed toward the curtained corner. Several men rushed forward, Colonel Melchett among them, and within moments the laughter on the green turned to a murmur of horror. Dr. March lay slumped in his chair, one hand outstretched, his spectacles cracked on the grass. A faint scent of bitter almonds hung in the air. Miss Marple rose slowly, her hand steadying on her cane. Around her, chaos gathered like a tide, voices overlapping, theories forming before the body had even cooled. Someone shouted for the constable, someone else cried that it must have been his heart, but Miss Marple's gaze rested on the overturned cup by his chair, the faint trace of lipstick on its rim, and the untouched biscuit beside it. She said nothing, she only sighed, folded her hands, and murmured almost to herself, "Poor man, so eager to cure everyone else, and yet no one thought to ask who might wish to cure him permanently." The sun still shone, but the fete was over. In street, Mary Mead, a doctor had prescribed silence, and someone had taken him at his word. By late afternoon, the fete had emptied into uneasy silence. The bunting drooped over tables of abandoned cakes, and the air still carried the bitter trace of almonds, faint but lingering like a whisper that refused to leave. The constable, young Inspector Reeves, stood by Dr. March's tent with an expression caught between disbelief and professional stiffness. He had been trained for order, for the neat arithmetic of cause and consequence, but this was different. The village doctor, a man trusted by nearly every household, was dead at his own event. Reeves took notes that would later read more confidently than he presently felt. Meanwhile, Miss Marple lingered near the tea tables, quietly gathering details others missed, her eyes as patient as a clock. Mrs. Bantry was the first to break. The paralysis of the crowd. "Heart failure, I expect," she declared, though her voice trembled slightly. "He worked far too hard." Her friend, Mrs. Price Ridley, leaned in close, whispering something about that poor woman he was seen with last week. Around them, a hum of gossip began, the sort that spread faster than truth ever could. Miss Marple heard none of it directly, at least. She appeared not to, but every raised voice, every pointed glance, was noted and stored in that calm, relentless mind of hers. By the time the doctor's body was taken to the small surgery on Church Lane, the sky had turned the pale gold of approaching evening. Reeves followed, awkwardly reassuring the crowd that there would be a full investigation. The villagers dispersed in pairs, some crossing themselves, others glancing toward Miss Marple, as if she were part of the natural order of such things, death, scandal, and Miss Marple's quiet certainty following soon after. She watched until the last of them left the green, then turned toward Mrs. Clement, who stood near the church gate, twisting her gloves. "Terrible, isn't it?" Miss Marple said softly. "A man in perfect health, so far as anyone knew." Mrs. Clement nodded quickly. Too quickly. "Yes, indeed. Tragic. Though perhaps he wasn't as well as he seemed. Doctors do keep their own ailments secret, don't they?" "Sometimes," Miss Marple agreed. "And sometimes it is other people's ailments that they keep secret." She smiled gently, as if she had said nothing of consequence, and walked on toward home, the hem of her skirt brushing the daisies. That evening, Street Mary Mead's routine reasserted itself in that odd, fragile way it always did after a disturbance. Curtains twitched, kettles boiled, and conversations began with expressions of grief before sliding, inevitably, into curiosity. Who had last spoken to Dr. March? Who had given him that cup of tea? And why had Mrs. Temple fainted so dramatically after seeing the body? The village, Miss Marple often thought, was like a living thing, its moods visible in the flutter of lace curtains and the slant of a lamp left burning too late. At 8:30, there was a knock at her door. It was Inspector Reeves, hat in hand, face pink with embarrassment. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said. "Aye, well, I thought perhaps you might have noticed something at the fete. You do have a knack for these things." Miss Marple looked modestly alarmed. "Oh dear, Inspector, I can't imagine what makes people say that. I'm only an old woman who happens to notice when something's out of place. One does, you know, after years of tidying up." Reeves smiled politely. "Still, you were near his tent. Anything you recall?" She paused as though searching her memory, though it was perfectly clear she hadn't forgotten a thing. Only that the poor man had quite a crowd about him earlier. Mrs. Temple was with him, and that young Miss Briggs, the pharmacist's daughter. He gave her a pamphlet on rest cures, I believe, and there was a cup beside him, tea, with a trace of lipstick on the rim. That struck me as odd. "Odd how?" Reeves asked. "Well," Miss Marple replied, "because Mrs. Temple wears rather a bold shade of rose, and the mark was pale. More like that, used by Molly Briggs. But perhaps I'm mistaken." Reeves wrote that down, frowning. "You think Miss Briggs gave him the tea?" "I think someone did," said Miss Marple gently, "and someone else watched her do it." After the inspector left, Miss Marple sat by her small writing desk, the lamplight soft against her knitting basket. The village outside seemed impossibly calm, yet she could feel the tremor beneath it. Death in a place like Street Mary Mead was never only about poison or passion, it was about propriety. Someone had taken advantage of what others believed could never happen here. She thought again of Dr. March's peculiar expression whenever he was thanked too warmly, the way his eyes had flicked to the side, wary. It was the look of a man keeping something carefully contained. The next morning, Reeves came again, this time with news. "They've found the teacup," he said. "And yes, cyanide. The medical examiner says he must have swallowed it within minutes of dying." Miss Marple nodded slowly, as though confirming something she already knew. "Bitter almonds," she murmured. "Yes, I thought as much." Reeves hesitated. "The odd thing is, there's no sign he mixed it himself. The poison was in the cup, but there's no container, no trace in his pockets. Whoever did it must have slipped it in right before he drank." "That would take timing," Miss Marple said. and a certain familiarity with his habits, perhaps someone who knew how long he let his tea cool. Reeves blinked. "You think it was planned?" "I think," she said, "that in a village where everyone talks, the clever murderer is the one who listens." She watched him leave, closing the door gently behind him. For a long while she remained still, her knitting untouched, her thoughts turning in that quiet, inexorable way they did. A doctor prescribing silence, a patient or perhaps more than one resenting it, and a cup of tea passed from one hand to another under the cheerful banner of community health. Miss Marple folded her hands. "People," she said softly to herself, "are seldom killed for one reason alone." Outside, the church bell began to toll, and the village came to a standstill once more. The investigation had begun, but for Miss Marple, it had already started long before the first question was asked. By the second morning, calm had become something of a performance in Street Mary Mead. The villagers moved about as they always did, fetching bread, watering flowers, exchanging pleasantries. But the air was charged with that delicate tension that follows a scandal too large to ignore. Even the sparrows seemed to chatter with purpose. Miss Marple, from her window seat, watched them as she sipped her morning tea. She had already read in the paper that the authorities were calling it suspicious circumstances, though anyone with sense knew it was murder. And in villages such as theirs, murder always began as something simple: envy, pride, or hurt feelings dressed up in respectability. Inspector Reeves arrived at the surgery just after 10. Dr. March's assistant, a nervous young man named Peter Welland, had been the one to discover that several files from the doctor's locked cabinet were missing. "Mostly routine," he explained, twisting his hands. "But one was labeled Temple, another Briggs, and one more marked simply S. That's what worries me. He was careful, Dr. March. He wouldn't have misplaced them." Reeves made a note, thanked him, and stepped outside, where Miss Marple happened to be strolling by, pausing to admire the hollyhocks with deliberate slowness. "Good morning, Inspector," she said pleasantly. "I was just on my way to the grocer's. Such dreadful times, aren't they? The poor man's affairs must be in disarray." Reeves gave her a patient look. "You wouldn't happen to know what Dr. March might have been keeping in his files, Miss Marple?" "Oh, one never knows, does one? People tell doctors all sorts of things they would never tell a priest or a neighbor. Though I have always thought secrets to be rather like garden weeds. Left alone, they strangle everything else." The inspector smiled faintly. "I suppose you've already guessed what that means." Miss Marple inclined her head. "It means, dear Inspector, that the roots are always deeper than they look." Later that day, Reeves questioned Mrs. Temple at her cottage near the post office. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, elegant but tightly wound, as though holding back too many emotions at once. Her late husband, a solicitor, had died some years before, and she had since grown rather fond of giving advice at parish meetings. She insisted she'd had no quarrel with Dr. March. "He was a man of great discretion," she said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "We spoke often about matters of health. Nothing more." When Reeves pressed her about her fainting spell, she gave a brittle smile. "I was shocked, naturally. Anyone would be. I just brought him a cup of tea. The idea that someone poisoned it. Why? It's monstrous." Reeves noted her words carefully. "I just brought him a cup of tea." Yet the lipstick Miss Marple had mentioned was not hers. He thanked her and left, though the question lingered like the smell of cyanide itself. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, young Molly Briggs. The girl looked pale, her eyes wide with guilt or fear, perhaps both. "I shouldn't be here, Miss Marple," she said, "but everyone's saying such dreadful things. They think that I gave him the tea." Miss Marple gestured for her to sit. "I wouldn't worry too much about what people say, my dear. They must always talk. It keeps them from thinking too hard about themselves. Now then, why don't you tell me what really happened?" Molly hesitated. "I went to his tent with a tray. same as always. Mrs. Temple asked me to take him a cup, said he'd been working too long without a break. I didn't think anything of it. He thanked me, but he looked strange, sad, somehow. He asked if I believed people could die from too much truth. I laughed, it sounded like a joke, but he didn't smile. Then I left. That's all. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Did you see anyone near his tent afterward? Yes, Molly said after a pause. Mr. Briggs, my father. He went to speak to him about a prescription. He was angry, though he tried to hide it. Said the doctor was ruining his business with all his new health fads. When the girl left, Miss Marple sat very still. So, there it was, the tea passed from Mrs. Temple to Molly, and possibly to Dr. March by way of a father with reason to hate him. Yet something in the girl's tone had troubled her. Guilt, yes, but not of murder. Guilt of omission. There was something Molly had chosen not to say. Something she feared more than accusation itself. The next morning, Reeves visited the village chemist, Mr. Briggs, a stout man with a blustering voice. He denied everything with offended pride. Rubbish. I've no reason to kill the man. Yes, he criticized my tonics, said they did more harm than good. But that's business rivalry, not murder. I respected him, even if he was a pompous fool. Reeves's eye fell on a locked drawer behind the counter. Poisoned cabinet, Briggs said quickly. Regulated, inspected, all proper. You can check it yourself. The inspector nodded but noted the faint chemical smell that hung in the air. Meanwhile, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Mrs. Clement. The vicar's wife was still pale, though she welcomed her with tea and the brittle cheer of someone trying too hard to appear calm. I can't believe it's come to this, she said. The doctor was doing such good work encouraging quiet reflection, the so-called rest cure. Some thought it peculiar, but he believed silence healed the mind. Silence can heal, Miss Marple said mildly. It can also conceal. Tell me, my dear, did anyone seem distressed by these sessions? Mrs. Clement hesitated, then sighed. Well, there was one. Mrs. Temple. Again, she said he'd urged her to withdraw from the Women's Committee for her own nerves. She didn't take it kindly, called it medical arrogance. Miss Marple smiled faintly. And arrogance, she murmured, often inspires murder more quickly than hatred. Outside, the church bell rang the hour, soft and slow. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her gloves. Thank you, my dear. You've been most helpful. As she stepped into the sunlight, she paused, her gaze following a young boy delivering parcels down the lane. In his hand was an envelope marked confidential, return to sender, and Miss Marple, watching him pass the doctor's shuttered surgery, felt that familiar spark of recognition, the smallest detail, overlooked by all, that would, in time, unravel everything. The silence Dr. March had prescribed was not healing. It was guilt, carefully administered in doses too small to notice until it killed. And someone, she thought, had finally taken the full measure. The following morning broke with a brittle kind of sunlight, too pale and clean for comfort. The village looked almost contrite beneath it, as if trying to wash itself of suspicion. Yet street, Mary Mead, for all its neat hedgerows and lace-curtained windows, could never truly conceal unease. Miss Marple saw it everywhere in the way people greeted each other too warmly, laughed too quickly, and watched the lane over their teacups. Murder, she often reflected, was not merely an event, it was a stain, and stains in villages had a habit of showing through. Inspector Reeves was at the vicarage when she arrived, his notebook already half filled with names and observations. Mrs. Clement, pale but composed, was serving tea as if the ceremony itself might restore order. Miss Marple, Reeves said, standing as she entered. I'm glad you came. I've just been going over the statements again. Something isn't adding up. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly and took her seat. Oh dear. Things rarely do, I find, until one looks at them from a slightly different angle. Reeves frowned down at his notes. Every account places Mrs. Temple as the one who brought the doctor his tea. but young Molly Briggs insists she was asked to carry it over. Now, Mrs. Temple admits asking her to, but claims she only meant to help. The poison was in that cup, and whoever handled it last well, that's where we must begin. Indeed, Miss Marple said, stirring her tea with quiet deliberation. Though beginnings are seldom as they seem, it is endings that tell the truth. Mrs. Clement set down a plate of scones, though her hands trembled slightly. I keep thinking about Dr. March's talk at the parish hall last week, she said. He spoke about peace of mind and the dangers of confession. Rather curious, don't you think? Almost ominous. Miss Marple's eyes brightened a little. Yes, he did have a fondness for the dramatic. It was that same evening, was it not, that he announced his intention to take some of his therapy notes to the authorities. A breach of confidence, one might say, unless those notes contained more than ailments. Reeves nodded grimly. You think someone was afraid he'd reveal something? I think, said Miss Marple, that people often fear being cured more than being ill. Later, walking home through the narrow lane that bordered the churchyard, Miss Marple paused by the gate. A small piece of paper had caught against the ivy, fluttering in the breeze. She plucked it free and smoothed it gently. It was a torn fragment of stationery, the kind used at the doctor's surgery. Only one line of writing remained. If silence cannot save you, confession surely will. She folded it carefully into her pocket and continued on, her expression unreadable. By the time she reached her cottage, a figure was waiting at her gate, Peter Welland, the doctor's assistant. He looked drawn, his coat buttoned crookedly. Miss Marple, I didn't know who else to talk to, he began. They're saying awful things about me now, that I destroyed the files, but I swear I didn't. Miss Marple motioned him inside. Calm yourself, Mr. Welland. Panic rarely clears anything up. Now, what exactly did you find missing? He sat, gripping his hat in both hands. 3 patient records, as I told the inspector. But there was more, his private notebook. He kept it locked in the lower drawer of his desk. He called it his mirror of truth. Said it was where he wrote his final observations about people. He told me once that if anything ever happened to him, it would explain everything. Did he, now? Miss Marple said softly. And has it been found? Well, no. The drawer was empty. I didn't dare mention it to Reeves, yet he'd think I was making it up. Miss Marple's knitting needles, lying idle beside her, gleamed in the lamplight like punctuation marks in thought. My dear boy, she said gently, the truth has a way of disappearing just long enough to make itself indispensable. That evening, while the rest of the village shuttered itself against twilight, Miss Marple walked to the surgery under the pretense of returning a borrowed book. The constable guarding the door, an earnest young man, let her in after some hesitation. Only a moment, she promised. I left my spectacles on the waiting room chair. Inside, the air was faintly metallic, tinged with disinfectant and something older, the ghost of medicine, or memory. The desk drawers were locked now, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a detail the police had overlooked, a faint impression in the dust where a small wooden crucifix once lay. Beside it, a scrap of ribbon green silk, of the sort used by Mrs. Temple to bind her letters. She smiled faintly, tucked it away, and left as quietly as she came. When she returned home, the clock struck 10. She lit her fire and sat in the familiar glow, turning over the fragments of the day like cards in a deck. A cup of tea prepared by one woman, carried by another, and perhaps delivered into the hands of a third. A doctor devoted to silence, keeping secrets that others wished buried. And now a missing notebook, the so-called mirror of truth that might name more than ailments. She thought of Mrs. Temple's polished composure, the way she had emphasized her fainting spell. As though performance could erase proximity, she thought too of Molly Briggs, her frightened eyes and her father's bitterness. But there was one person whose anxiety seemed too quiet, too contained. Mrs. Clement so pale, so helpful, so afraid. A woman of conscience, perhaps, caught between faith and knowledge. Miss Marple set down her teacup, her mind tightening like a drawn thread. Somewhere among them lay the truth, and it was beginning to speak not loudly, but insistently. The doctor had prescribed silence. Yes, but someone had mistaken that for absolution. And absolution, Miss Marple knew, was often the deadliest cure of all. The fire crackled, and outside the church bell tolled once before fading into the night. In its echo, she could almost hear it, the faint, deliberate rhythm of deceit unraveling, one polite conversation at a time. The next morning brought rain fine and silvery, veiling the village in a hush that seemed almost deliberate. It slicked the cobblestones and blurred the neat hedgerows until street Mary Mead appeared half-remembered, half-erased. Miss Marple, however, was wide awake before dawn, her knitting forgotten on her lap as she considered the fragments she had collected. A torn note about confession, a missing notebook, a silk ribbon, and too many polite lies. By the time the church clock chimed 8, she had made up her mind. There was a visit she needed to pay, and it could not wait. Mrs. Temple's house stood on the edge of the village, a prim little structure smothered in ivy, its windows too clean, its silence too deliberate. The woman herself answered the door. Still in her dressing gown, her composure strained. "Miss Marple." What an unexpected call. "Do come in, though. I'm afraid I'm hardly presentable." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, I do apologize for the intrusion. I only wanted to return something of yours." She drew from her bag the green silk ribbon she had found in the surgery. Mrs. Temple's eyes widened a fraction too much before she caught herself. "Why, yes, how strange. I must have dropped it during the fete." "How fortunate," Miss Marple murmured, placing it on the table. "You see, it was found in the late doctor's office. One does wonder how it traveled there. He was such a careful man." Mrs. Temple's hand tightened around her teacup. "You're suggesting I? My dear Miss Marple. Surely you don't mean to imply—" "Oh, I imply nothing," Miss Marple said mildly. "I've simply found that ribbons, like secrets, tend to attach themselves where they're least wanted." She rose then, smoothing her skirt. "Do forgive me, my dear. I do hope you'll be at the memorial service tomorrow. It's so important, isn't it, to pay respects properly?" When Miss Marple left, Mrs. Temple stood frozen for several minutes, staring at the ribbon as though it might accuse her aloud. Then, slowly, she crossed the room and drew the curtains. Later that day, Inspector Reeves arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, his collar wet from the drizzle. "You were right about the missing notebook," he said grimly. "We've found traces of where it was kept, dust outlines, scratches, but no sign of the book itself. Whoever took it knew exactly what they were after." Miss Marple motioned for him to sit. "And did you discover who had access to that office after the fete?" "Only a handful," Reeves replied. "Mrs. Temple, Molly Briggs, and the vicar's wife. Mrs. Clement brought flowers later that evening, said she couldn't sleep. The assistant swears he locked up afterward. We've checked every drawer and shelf." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, "but sometimes what's missing is not hidden, it's displaced. People rarely hide what they intend to return." Reeves frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning," she said, "that if the book isn't where it ought to be, perhaps it's where it shouldn't, somewhere quite ordinary, where no one would think to question it, like the church vestry, perhaps." That suggestion took root. By the afternoon, Reeves and his constable were searching the vestry under the pretext of reorganizing hymnals. There, beneath a stack of donation ledgers, they found the notebook, its leather cover cracked, the first pages marked in Dr. March's neat, slanted hand. Reeves brought it straight to Miss Marple, who regarded it as one might a dangerous animal. The entries were clinical, restrained, and chilling. patient initials followed by terse observations. MT, resentment masked as virtue, conceals hatred of dependence. MB, fear of discovery, trust easily won, loyalty uncertain. And then C, confession denied, silence prescribed, risk escalating. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. C, she murmured. Mrs. Clement. Reeves exhaled. Good Lord. You think the vicar's wife? Miss Marple shook her head slowly. I think the doctor made himself a repository of sins. He wrote what he should never have written, and those he observed began to fear that his silence might one day break. That evening, as dusk gathered like breath on glass, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage once more. The house was dim, the fire low. Mrs. Clement sat in the drawing-room, her Bible open on her lap, though her eyes were unfocused. I wondered when you'd come, she said softly. I saw them take the notebook. Miss Marple settled opposite her, hands folded. Then you know what it contained. Mrs. Clement nodded, her composure fragile. He knew everything, Miss Marple. He counseled me when I lost faith. I told him things no one should hear, and then he said he was writing it all down to show others how confession could heal. I begged him not to. He promised discretion, but I saw his notes. My name, my words, his interpretations. It was like he'd taken my soul and pinned it on a page. And so, Miss Marple said quietly, you went to him that evening. Mrs. Clement closed her eyes. I wanted only to reason with him. But Mrs. Temple was already there, shouting at him about her own sessions, about her reputation. He told her to leave, said he would report her interference in the parish committee. She stormed out. And I stayed. I saw him pour tea. He offered me some. I refused, and when I left, he was alive. Yet he died moments later, Miss Marple said gently, which means someone returned after you. Mrs. Clement's eyes widened. Returned? Then it wasn't, oh dear God. It wasn't you, Miss Marple said, but someone who knew you'd been there, someone who would let suspicion rest easily on your shoulders. She rose, placing a kind hand on the woman's arm. Thank you, my dear. You've been very brave. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the village wrapped in damp stillness. Miss Marple walked slowly home, her thoughts precise and deliberate. The truth was taking shape, like embroidery emerging through careful stitches. Mrs. Temple had quarreled with the doctor. Mrs. Clement had begged for discretion. And yet, somewhere between them, another hand had acted quietly, efficiently, with knowledge of poison and access to the cup. She reached her gate and paused, her eyes lifting toward the dim light of the chemist's shop, still burning down the lane. Mr. Briggs rarely stayed open so late. Inside, she imagined the soft clink of glass, the measured precision of a man used to mixing both cures and deaths. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, she whispered to herself. Silence was prescribed, but perhaps it was manufactured. The bell at the church tower struck 9, and the village once again held its breath. The following day dawned grey and close. The kind of morning when the air itself seems to hold its breath. The village was subdued. Though not silent, one could still hear the faint murmur of conversation outside the grocer's, the scrape of a broom on stone, and the rustle of the newspaper as it changed hands more often than news usually deserved. The headline said little, only that the authorities were pursuing active inquiries into Dr. March's sudden death, but the words underneath whispered, not printed, were louder. The doctor's secrets, the chemist's temper, the women's quarrels. Everyone had their theory, but none had the truth. Miss Marple, however, had a visitor before breakfast. Inspector Reeves arrived, looking tired but determined, his hat damp from the lingering drizzle. "I've just come from the chemist's," he said. "You were right to point me there." Briggs admitted he'd been furious with Dr. March. The doctor stopped recommending his tonics, said they contained unhealthy compounds. Briggs says that ruined his business, but he swears he didn't kill him. Miss Marple nodded, pouring tea. Oh, I don't imagine he did. Men like Mr. Briggs make noise instead of trouble. If he'd meant murder, the whole village would have heard the quarrel first. Reeves smiled faintly. You always make it sound so simple. Human nature is simple, my dear Inspector, Miss Marple replied. It's only people who complicate it. Now, did he say anything of his daughter? Molly? Only that she's been hysterical since the death. Says she feels watched. She claims someone's been leaving notes at their door, just scraps of paper with verses about guilt and sin. We've kept one. It's the same handwriting as that torn note you found. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. Ah. Then we may assume the good doctor's handwriting has not gone to rest as peacefully as he has. Reeves frowned. You mean someone's using it? Quite so, she said softly. Someone who had access to his papers, perhaps even that missing notebook, before it was hidden in the vestry. Fear, Inspector, is a useful weapon, and guilt is its shadow. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the chemist's under the pretext of ordering lavender salts. The shop smelled faintly of camphor and soap, but beneath it lingered something sharper, chemical and uneasy. Molly stood behind the counter, pale but composed. Good afternoon, Miss Marple, she said, forcing a smile. Father's out back. I can help you, if you like. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. You've been very brave, my dear. It isn't easy being looked at by everyone as though one might have done something dreadful. Molly's hand faltered slightly over the scale weights. They all think I did it, don't they? Because I carried the tea. People think what is convenient for them, Miss Marple said gently. But I don't. You see, the tea was poisoned before you ever touched it. Whoever gave it to Dr. March already knew you would deliver it. Molly's eyes widened. Then it could have been anyone who handled the tray first. Not anyone, Miss Marple corrected softly. Someone who knew the pattern of the day. Who knew Mrs. Temple would ask you to bring it, that you would obey, and that no one would suspect such a small, polite favor. Molly swallowed hard. You mean Mrs. Temple? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She merely smiled, that delicate, non-committal smile that concealed more than it revealed. Tell me, my dear, was Mrs. Temple friendly with your father? Molly blinked. Friendly? Oh, well. She came to the shop often. Said she needed herbal powders for her nerves. Father always made special mixtures for her. She used to stay and talk. About her late husband, mostly. I don't think Father liked it much, but she was charming when she wanted to be. Miss Marple nodded, thanked her, and departed, the small bell above the door chiming softly as she stepped back into the damp afternoon. She walked slowly, letting the puzzle arrange itself in her mind. A ribbon in the surgery, a missing notebook, poison from the chemist, and now friendship between the widow and the apothecary. Charm, after all, was a very practical weapon for women like Mrs. Temple. By evening, the rain had stopped, and the memorial service filled the church with that uneasy solemnity peculiar to small communities that know too much. Mrs. Temple was there, veiled in black, her expression serene but watchful. The Briggses sat near the back, stiff and uncomfortable. Mrs. Clement sat near the altar, pale as parchment. Miss Marple, in her modest navy coat, observed them all from her place by the aisle. The service was brief. Reeves stood near the door, nodding to her once, almost imperceptibly. Afterward, as the congregation spilled into the misty graveyard, Miss Marple lingered near the lich gate. She caught sight of Mr. Briggs lighting a cigarette with trembling hands, his daughter beside him. Mrs. Temple approached, her tone low but insistent. You've said enough already, Henry. Keep your mouth shut about those powders. Do you hear me? Or I'll... She stopped abruptly when she noticed Miss Marple watching, her pale eyes mild but unwavering. Good evening, Mrs. Temple, Miss Marple said pleasantly. A sad occasion, isn't it? One hopes the doctor will finally have the peace he so valued in life. Mrs. Temple's smile was tight. Peace, yes, though some of us have had quite enough silence lately. She turned sharply and walked away, her heels clicking like punctuation marks of irritation. When they were gone, Miss Marple stood quietly beneath the archway, the faint scent of wet earth rising around her. She had seen what she needed to see, the quick flash of fear in Mr. Briggs's eyes, the edge of control in Mrs. Temple's voice. A secret bound them, though not equally. One had been coerced, the other commanding. And yet, Miss Marple thought, there was still something missing. The doctor's words lingered in her mind. If silence cannot save you, confession surely will. She walked home in the deepening twilight, the lanterns glowing dimly in cottage windows. Somewhere behind one of those windows was the hand that had measured death into a cup. She could almost feel the truth waiting now, trembling on the edge of revelation. It was close enough that the village itself seemed to sense it, holding its breath once more before the final exhale. Miss Marple smiled faintly as she reached her gate. The human heart, she murmured, is rather like a cupboard. You may shut the door upon something unpleasant, but sooner or later, it knocks to be let out. Inside, the clock struck 10. The night deepened, and street Mary Mead prepared, unknowingly, for the moment when all its carefully arranged silences would finally speak. The morning after the memorial dawned with a peculiar quietness, too soft, too deliberate. The mist still clung to the hedgerows, blurring the edges of the village until everything looked slightly unreal, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple awoke early, stirred not by habit but by certainty. The last threads of the puzzle were tightening. She felt it in that quiet, patient way she always did when truth began to press against the surface of lies. She dressed with care, made her tea, and waited. She didn't have to wait long. At precisely 8:30, there came a knock at her door. It was Inspector Reeves, his expression weary but alert. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat. "I think you were right. There's more to Mrs. Temple than meets the eye. Briggs came to see me this morning. Said she'd threatened him last night after the service." Miss Marple smiled faintly. How very hasty of her. Guilt, you see, doesn't always make people cautious, it makes them clumsy. "Sit down, Inspector, and tell me precisely what he said." Reeves produced his notebook. According to Briggs, she demanded he destroy certain pharmacy records orders she'd placed for laudanum and potassium cyanide. She claimed they were for household pests. He says he kept copies, just in case. "Very wise of him," Miss Marple said quietly. "And what of Molly?" "She's missing," Reeves replied grimly. "Didn't come home last night. Her father's frantic." Miss Marple's eyes darkened. "Ah, then we must hurry. Murder rarely ends neatly. Inspector, it has a way of trying to cover its own tracks." She rose, reached for her coat, and added, "I believe Mrs. Temple will have visitors this morning, one way or another." By the time they reached Ivy House, the day had sharpened. The mist was thinning into light, and the village street gleamed wetly. Mrs. Temple answered their knock herself. Her face was composed, but her eyes flickered toward the sitting room before she spoke. "Inspector, Miss Marple, to what do I owe this early pleasure?" Reeves' tone was firm. "I'm afraid we'll need you to come with us, Mrs. Temple. There are some questions about your orders from the chemist." Her expression faltered just for a heartbeat before she laughed a brittle, unconvincing sound. "Questions? About insecticide? My dear man, are you suggesting?" But at that moment, a faint noise came from inside the house. A soft cry, quickly muffled. Reeves pushed past her, Miss Marple following close behind. In the drawing room, half hidden behind a heavy curtain, sat Molly Briggs, pale and trembling, a suitcase beside her. Her eyes darted toward Mrs. Temple like a trapped bird's. "Molly," Reeves exclaimed, "what on earth are you doing here?" Mrs. Temple's composure collapsed. "I was only trying to help her," she said, quickly. "The poor child came to me in tears, saying her father accused her of theft of poison, no less. I couldn't send her back to that house. The whole village is turning on her." Miss Marple's voice was soft but cutting. "How noble of you. And yet, my dear, it seems a curious sort of refuge. The very woman whose tea you asked her to deliver, offering her shelter now that the doctor is dead." Temple drew herself up, but her face had lost its color. "You can't prove anything." "No," Miss Marple said quietly, "but I can understand everything. You see, the poison did not come from your household pest remedies at all. It came from the chemist, yes, but it was ordered under another's name. Molly's. You used her trust, her youth, and her father's profession. You made her fetch it, told her it was harmless, perhaps for some experiment or tonic. And then, when Dr. March threatened to expose what he knew about you, your little entanglement with prescription fraud, the quiet extortions, the gossip you traded for influence, you used that same poison on him. You let Molly carry the tea, knowing it would tie her to the act. A clever plan, had you not tied your own ribbon around it." Mrs. Temple swayed slightly, her hand clutching the back of a chair. "You have no evidence," she whispered. Miss Marple turned to Reeves. "On the contrary, the evidence is rather fond of presenting itself. Mr. Briggs has the order slips in Molly's name. The chemist's ledger will show the dates, and the doctor's notebook, his mirror of truth, contains a final entry. It reads, "MT believes silence is power. She forgets it is also guilt." He wrote that the night before his death. There was a long, dreadful pause. Outside, a church bell began to toll in the distance, slow and measured. Mrs. Temple sank into a chair, her defiance slipping away like a mask. "He was going to ruin me," she said finally, her voice hollow. "I only meant to frighten him. To remind him he wasn't the only one who could destroy reputations. But when I saw him drink, when he smiled at me as if he knew I couldn't stop him, he just kept talking about confession, about redemption. I hated that smile." Molly let out a choked sob, and Miss Marple went to her, resting a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "Hush, my dear. You've suffered enough. You were used, that's all. The cruelest kind of deceit is the one that borrows another's innocence." Reeves stood motionless for a moment, then quietly signaled to the constable outside. Mrs. Temple didn't resist when they led her away. Only as she reached the door did she look back at Miss Marple. "You think you understand people, Miss Marple," she said softly, "but you don't. None of you do. You call it justice, but it's just gossip with a noose." Miss Marple said nothing. When they were gone, she remained standing for a long time, her eyes on the faint circle left by a teacup on the table. "No, my dear," she murmured at last. "It isn't gossip that kills, it's the silence before it." That evening, as twilight drew its pale curtain over the village once more, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting slowly, the rhythm of the needles soothing against the lingering disquiet. Through her window, she could see the faint lights of the chemist's shop, now shuttered, and hear the distant murmur of the constable's steps. Life in Street Mary Mead would return to its delicate order soon enough. But for now, she allowed herself a sigh, quiet, knowing, and touched with sorrow. In the end, it was, as it always was, a village that whispered too much, and one woman who had simply listened better than the rest. The following days passed with an almost reverent stillness. News of Mrs. Temple's arrest spread through Street Mary Mead like a storm, whispered through lace curtains. Every house heard of it, every tongue turned it over, but none dared say too much in public. The chemist's shop reopened under the subdued care of Mr. Briggs, who moved about like a man twice his age. Molly, pale and fragile, had gone to stay with her aunt in Market Down. a kindness arranged quietly by Miss Marple herself. The village was returning to its shape, but, as Miss Marple often observed, a village never returned exactly the same after a death. The edges shifted, ever so slightly, as if some invisible thread had been snipped. On the third morning, Inspector Reeves came to call again, looking rather more troubled than satisfied. Miss Marple, who was deadheading her roses, invited him in before he could speak. "You look as if you've swallowed something disagreeable, Inspector," she said kindly. He sighed, removing his hat. "I almost wish I had. Mrs. Temple, she's dead." Miss Marple paused, her pruning shears halfway to a bloom. "Dead? Last night," Reeves said grimly. "Poison again. She took it herself in her cell. A small vial hidden in the lining of her coat. Cyanide, same as the doctor. The doctor's case is closed, I suppose, but it doesn't feel like justice. It feels messy." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "It often does, Inspector. People who live by concealment rarely die tidily." She motioned him to sit. "Still, I wonder who gave her the opportunity to carry poison into custody. I assume her belongings were searched?" "They were," Reeves said, frowning. "But the lining of her coat was thick. It could have been there for weeks. She might have kept it as a precaution." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, I don't think Mrs. Temple ever believed she'd be caught. Not until the end. Fear changes hands in curious ways, Inspector. It may be that someone wished her silenced before she could speak further." Reeves leaned forward. "You think someone else was involved?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, but her tone carried weight. "I think murder, once set in motion, rarely stops where the murderer intends it to. It tends to spill like ink or gossip. Mrs. Temple knew more than she ever admitted. She might have shared it with someone in the days before her arrest, someone she trusted or feared." That evening, when Reeves had gone, Miss Marple sat by her window watching the lamps flicker across the village street. She thought of the doctor's notebook, its neat, damning handwriting, and the curious final entries. There had been one she hadn't shared with Reeves. Not yet. She'd noticed it on her second reading, almost by accident, scrawled faintly between two patient notes. "Confidant within confession, keeper of silence beyond need." She had suspected what it meant, but now, with Mrs. Temple gone, its meaning turned colder in her mind. The next morning, she walked to the church. Mrs. Clement was there, arranging lilies near the altar, her hands steady but her face pale. She turned, startled, when Miss Marple approached. "Oh, Miss Marple, you frightened me. I didn't hear you come in." "My apologies, my dear. You've been working hard, I see." "Anything to keep busy," Mrs. Clement said quietly. "It's all been so dreadful. I can hardly believe Mrs. Temple is gone." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Quite final, isn't it? Poison leaves so little room for second chances." Mrs. Clement's hands froze among the flowers. "You think she meant to kill herself?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that she may not have been entirely alone in that decision. Tell me, my dear, did you visit her after her arrest?" Mrs. Clement turned, eyes wide. "No. Why should I? I barely knew the woman." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "and yet the two of you shared something rather intimate, the same confessor, the same need for discretion. She told me once that you had spoken together at length about Dr. March's methods. She admired your restraint." Mrs. Clement took a step back, her face whitening. "That's absurd. She was unwell. Everyone knows she imagined slights and conspiracies." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, still mild. "Though it was strange, wasn't it, that she knew of your visits to the doctor when no one else did, and that she used your name when she ordered the vials of laudanum from Mr. Briggs last winter. She must have found your trust convenient." Mrs. Clement sank onto the nearest pew, her composure unraveling like torn lace. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear, I didn't. She told me she was making medicines for charity, soothing balms for the infirm. I thought it was harmless. Her voice broke. She said she'd confess everything, that the doctor forced her hand. She begged me to keep her secret until after the fete, and then he was dead. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her words were precise. And when she was arrested, you kept her secret still perhaps too well. You visited her under the guise of the parish committee, didn't you? Brought her shawl and some letters from her house. I imagine the poison was in one of them. She trusted you to deliver it, and you did, without knowing what it was. Mrs. Clement bowed her head, trembling. She said it was medicine to help her sleep. I thought I was being kind. Miss Marple sighed. You were, and that, my dear, is the tragedy of it. Kindness, like truth, can be quite fatal when placed in the wrong hands. By the time Inspector Reeves arrived at the church, Mrs. Clement had confessed enough to clear her conscience and condemn her peace of mind forever. She would not be charged. Miss Marple ensured that there was no malice in what she'd done, only weakness. Yet the story of the doctor's death would linger in the parish for years, retold in softer tones as time weathered its edges. That night, Miss Marple sat alone, knitting by the fire. The rhythm was steady, the wool pale as the morning mist. She thought of Dr. March, of his obsession with silence, and the irony of his end. In trying to cure others of their secrets, he had simply multiplied them. The village would sleep again, but beneath its calm surface, there would always be the memory of that poisoned cup, and of how many hands had carried it before it reached his lips. Miss Marple looked into the fire, her eyes distant but clear. There are cures, she murmured, that heal only the patient and destroy everyone else. Outside, the church bell tolled softly once more, and street, Mary Mead exhaled, as though the village itself had finally, painfully, learned to breathe again. The next day dawned with a faint warmth, a deceptive calm that seemed to promise the return of ordinary life. The church bell rang for morning prayers, the milkman clattered down the lane, and street Mary Mead exhaled as though trying to forget the shadow that had settled over it. Yet beneath the gentle murmur of routine, something restless stirred. Inspector Reeves, though officially satisfied with his report, could not quite shake the sense that the case had not closed of its own accord. It had been sealed too tidily, too completely, like a letter no one dared to open again. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat by her window, watching the sunlight creep across her roses. To anyone passing, she looked perfectly serene. But her thoughts moved with quiet precision, circling the one question that had not yet been answered. It was late morning when Reeves arrived once more, hat in hand, a man uneasy with his own conclusion. Miss Marple, he said, stepping into the familiar warmth of her sitting room, I've come to trouble you again, I'm afraid. I keep thinking about that notebook, the doctor's final entries, those last few lines. You said they read confidant within confession, keeper of silence beyond need. It's been gnawing at me. If that was about Mrs. Clement, he must have known she'd been used. But why write it down if he'd already forgiven her? What was he trying to leave behind? Miss Marple looked at him over her spectacles, her knitting idle in her lap. Perhaps, Inspector, he wasn't writing to forgive her at all. Perhaps he was leaving a record of warning for someone else. Warning? Reeves frowned. You mean, for who? Mrs. Temple? Miss Marple shook her head. No, for the person he truly feared, the one who first set all of this in motion. You see, Dr. March was clever, but not wise. He believed in moral reform, not human frailty. And when he started writing down what people told him in confidence, he turned confession into a kind of power. There was someone who saw that, someone who realized that kind of power could be profitable. Reeves leaned forward. You're saying this wasn't just a crime of anger or revenge. It began that way, perhaps, but it grew into something else. Think of Mr. Briggs. His business was failing, his daughter dependent on his income. He supplied medicine to everyone, including the doctor. What if someone persuaded him that silence, true silence, could be bought? The doctor's patience paid for discretion, after all. And if one had access to his notes, well, even in a small village, secrets are a currency of sorts. Reeves stiffened. You think Briggs was blackmailing him? Not directly, Miss Marple said, rising to pour tea. But perhaps he was complicit. I suspect the first poison wasn't meant to kill at all, only to frighten. A trace dose, enough to remind the doctor of his own vulnerability. Only Mrs. Temple, anxious and impulsive, made certain it was lethal. Reeves rubbed his chin, absorbing the idea. Then when she was caught, Briggs panicked. Precisely, Miss Marple said. He knew her arrest would expose him. He couldn't risk her talking. So when Mrs. Clement, poor soul, brought the shawl and letters, someone else ensured one of them contained a vial. The chemist's shop was the perfect place to hide it until the moment arrived. There was a long silence. Outside, the wind stirred the garden leaves with a dry whisper. Reeves stood, pacing the small room, his boots creaking against the floorboards. It fits, he said finally, and I'll wager that if we search the shop again, we'll find the rest of that cyanide, perhaps even the bottle used for both killings. Miss Marple smiled faintly. You may find something more, Inspector. Look for the doctor's missing prescriptions ledger. I imagine Mr. Briggs removed it the same day the notebook disappeared. He was far too methodical to destroy evidence that proved his reach. He would keep it as insurance. By late afternoon, Reeves returned, face pale, hat in hand once again. You were right, Miss Marple, he said, his voice low. We found it, hidden behind the wall panel in the storeroom, the ledger, the rest of the cyanide, and something else. It was a letter, the ink blurred by moisture, but the handwriting unmistakable. Neat, deliberate. Dr. March's hand. Reeves read aloud, To whom it may concern. I have been asked to remain silent, but I cannot. The prescriptions were falsified at the chemist's request, orders made under the names of patients who never existed. If I die suddenly, you will know why. Those who profit from silence must one day pay for it. Miss Marple listened without surprise. Then it is over, she said softly. The truth, like illness, spreads until it meets the cure it deserves. That evening, as the constables escorted Mr. Briggs through the village, the townsfolk watched from behind curtains, their whispers mingling with the hum of evening insects. Molly's absence spared her the sight, though her name was murmured with pity and relief alike. Street, Mary Mead, for all its decorum, thrived on the gentle cruelty of survival, the way people adapted, rebalanced, and forgot just enough to carry on. Later, Inspector Reeves returned once more, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. You've done it again, Miss Marple, though I can't say it feels like victory. 3 deaths, and all because one man wrote down what he should have left unsaid. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes on the firelight. Ah, but that is human nature, Inspector. We mistake knowledge for safety, when in truth, it only sharpens the knife. The doctor prescribed silence, you see, but forgot to take his own medicine, and those who kept his secret. They swallowed it whole. Reeves said nothing more. He left her there, framed by the warm glow of her sitting room, the fire murmuring softly. Outside, the night deepened, carrying with it the final echoes of scandal, the rustle of a village settling once again into its delicate rhythm of civility and concealment. When the last light flickered out in the lane, Miss Marple folded her knitting and looked toward the darkened window. The reflection that met her gaze was calm, almost kindly, yet behind it flickered the sharp, unflinching intelligence of a woman who had seen too many tragedies disguised as decency. People, she whispered into the stillness, always think death is the end, but in truth, it only begins where gossip leaves off. Outside, the moon slipped free of the clouds, casting its pale light over street Mary Mead, peaceful again, if only on the surface. The following morning brought with it a kind of uneasy stillness that Street Mary Mead knew well, the pause between scandal and remembrance. The arrest of Mr. Briggs had left the villagers stunned. Yet there was an undeniable relief that the web of deceit had finally been untangled. At least, that was what most of them believed. Miss Marple, however, felt a small, persistent doubt. She had learned through long experience that evil, once disturbed, rarely confined itself neatly to a single culprit. The doctor, Mrs. Temple, Mr. Briggs all had played their parts, but something about the pattern still felt unfinished. As though one thread remained hidden in the weave. Inspector Reeves called on her again that afternoon, more out of habit than necessity. He found her seated by the fire, her knitting basket beside her, the soft click of needles filling the space between their words. "I've just come from the station," he began. "Briggs is talking now. Says he falsified the prescriptions, yes, but claims he did it under pressure. Not from Mrs. Temple, not even from greed. He insists someone else asked him to do it. Someone with influence." Miss Marple looked up, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. Influence, Inspector, is a curious word. It can mean persuasion or fear. Did he give a name? Not yet, Reeves admitted. Says he can't. That he promised someone he'd never tell, even if it killed him. Miss Marple's hands paused, the wool resting in her lap. A promise made under fear isn't loyalty, it's bondage. I wonder, Inspector, whether our dear doctor was the only one skilled at manipulating silence. Reeves frowned. You think there's someone else still pulling strings? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I think silence was a contagion in this case. The doctor prescribed it, Mrs. Temple abused it. And now Briggs hides behind it. But someone else encouraged it from the very beginning. Before Reeves could reply, a sharp knock sounded at the door. It was the vicar, his face pale and strained, his hat dripping rain onto the mat. Forgive the intrusion, he said, glancing nervously between them. But something's happened at the church. I thought, well, after all that's occurred, you might wish to see for yourself. The three of them walked down the narrow lane together, the air damp and heavy. The church door was open, the scent of candle wax mingling with cold stone. On the altar lay a folded sheet of paper weighed down by a single silver cross. Miss Marple approached it slowly, her heart tightening. She recognized the handwriting at once, Mrs. Clement's. Reeves unfolded the letter carefully. It was brief, its tone composed but weary. I cannot bear the burden of knowing what I know. The village will never forgive me, and nor will I. I did not kill Dr. March, but I helped to keep alive what killed him. Forgive me. I go now to seek peace, where no one asks for silence. The words seemed to echo in the vaulted ceiling. Reeves looked up sharply. We must find her. They did, though not far. The vicar's wife was discovered soon after, sitting by the small stream that ran behind the rectory garden. The bottle beside her was empty, the same bitter scent clinging to the grass. She had died quietly, as though sleep had taken her hand. That night, the village seemed to fold into itself, its lights dimmer, its conversations hushed. Even those who prided themselves on being unshakable spoke softly, unwilling to tempt the darkness further. Reeves stayed late at the station, his notes spread across the desk. But nothing he wrote could make sense of the sorrow that lingered over the town. When he finally left, he passed Miss Marple's cottage and saw her lamp still burning. He hesitated, then knocked. She greeted him without surprise. I wondered if you'd come, she said, pouring him tea. You look as though you've seen more than you care to. I don't understand it, he confessed. Mrs. Clement was innocent. She knew the truth, yes, but she hadn't done anything criminal. Why take her own life? Miss Marple sighed, her expression sorrowful. Because guilt isn't always about deeds, Inspector. Sometimes it's about endurance. She lived among people who mistake silence for virtue, who prize discretion over truth. She carried their shame as if it were her own. In the end, it broke her. Reeves rubbed a hand over his face. So this is it, then. 3 dead, 1 ruined. And for what? A few secrets and a ledger. Miss Marple stirred her tea, her gaze distant. For reputation, Inspector. For pride. You see, what began with the doctor's vanity ended with the village's. Each person feared exposure more than they feared wrongdoing itself. That, I'm afraid, is the truest poison of all. Reeves fell silent. The clock ticked between them, steady and indifferent. Finally, he rose. You know, he said quietly, if you ever wanted to help the yard, I could find a place for you. You've the makings of the sharpest mind in England. Miss Marple smiled, a touch of amusement softening her features. Oh, I think not, Inspector. The yard deals in crimes of action. I deal in crimes of character, and those, I'm afraid, never run out. When he had gone, she remained by the fire, the quiet ticking of the clock merging with the crackle of burning wood. Outside, the village began to settle again into its routines. The next morning, the papers would call it the Doctor's Silence Tragedy. A neat phrase to close the chapter. But for Miss Marple, no such closure existed. She knew that the real story was not one of murder, but of the small cruelties that festered in polite houses, the whispered judgments that could wound more deeply than any poison. She looked out the window toward the church, its spire cutting cleanly against the night sky. People, she murmured to herself, speak of evil as though it hides in strangers, but it doesn't, does it? It lives in the pauses, in the polite smiles, in the silences that should have been broken. The fire burned lower, casting long, thin shadows across her walls. She set her knitting aside at last, folded her hands, and let the stillness settle around her like a shawl. Somewhere far off, an owl called across the fields, its lonely cry, carrying over the rooftops of Street Mary Mead, a village now quieter than ever, though not, Miss Marple thought sadly, any wiser. For several days after Mrs. Clement's passing, Street Mary Mead moved like a village half asleep. Curtains were drawn early, church bells rang softer, and even the sparrows seemed subdued, as if they too understood that something sacred had broken. Inspector Reeves remained in town to conclude his paperwork, though his visits grew less official and more habitual, drawn, perhaps unconsciously, to the only person whose company soothed the moral ache of unfinished business. Miss Marple received him kindly, offering her neat sitting room and an endless supply of tea, though she suspected that both of them knew the case was not quite at rest. Deaths, after all, could end neatly on paper while leaving the soul of a village quietly disturbed. On the 4th morning, Reeves arrived with a troubled look that Miss Marple recognized at once. "You've heard, of course," he began without preamble, removing his hat and setting it down with deliberate care. "They found something this morning behind the church organ, of all places." A small metal box. Miss Marple looked up from her embroidery. "Indeed? That sounds promising or ominous." "Both, perhaps." He drew a folded note from his pocket. Inside were several documents belonging to Dr. March, letters, receipts, even photographs. But this, he handed her the note. It was brief and written in an unfamiliar hand, slanted and elegant. "For those who believe the truth is buried, look not at the silence but who profits from it." The doctor was not the last to prescribe death. Miss Marple read it twice, her eyes narrowing. "That handwriting," she said quietly, "is not Mrs. Temple's, nor Mrs. Clement's. No, this is a man's hand, steady, precise, someone educated, but perhaps accustomed to concealment." Reeves nodded grimly. "We had it compared with Mr. Briggs's statements. It doesn't match his either. But the note mentions profit. You think it implies another motive?" "My dear Inspector," said Miss Marple, setting the paper down, "there has always been another motive. Vanity, guilt, and pride explain much, but profit explains the rest. The question is, who in this village has profited most by the doctor's death. Reeves frowned, considering. The chemist's shop will be inherited by Molly, but that hardly qualifies. The surgery's been closed, and his estate is modest. Miss Marple's expression softened into the faintest smile. You are thinking in legal terms, Inspector. I was thinking in human ones. Reputation, you see, can be as valuable as property. That afternoon, she went walking through the high street, leaning on her cane, her eyes seemingly distracted by shop fronts and flower pots, but in truth, registering every twitch of a curtain, every whisper that passed as she went by. Street Mary Mead was beginning to heal, or so it liked to believe. Yet there, behind polite greetings and sympathetic nods, Miss Marple detected the faint tremor of unease that came when people suspected more than they dared to say. She stopped outside the post office where Miss Hartwell, the postmistress, was sorting letters with brisk authority. A dreadful business, Miss Hartwell said, not looking up. Still, I suppose we can rest now that the guilty have faced their judgment. Rest, perhaps, Miss Marple said gently, though one never truly rests when there are unanswered letters. The woman paused, her hands stiffening. I don't follow. Oh, I think you do, Miss Marple murmured. You've managed the village post for 20 years. You see every parcel, every correspondence. Tell me, how many letters did Dr. March receive from outside Street Mary Mead in the weeks before his death? Miss Hartwell hesitated, then lowered her voice. Only one that I recall. A foreign one, French postmark, hand-delivered by a private courier. He came just a few days before the fete. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, her eyes sharpening. And what became of that letter? He asked me to hold it for him, said Miss Hartwell nervously. Said it was personal, and that he'd collect it after the fair, but he never did. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple turned the facts over like cards in her mind. A foreign letter, a warning in a stranger's hand, and now a hidden box behind a church organ too deliberate to be coincidence. The threads led beyond the village now, or rather, to someone within it who had connections beyond. There was one man who fit that description neatly. The vicar himself, formerly a missionary in France, who had quietly kept his correspondence with various foreign parishes. That evening, she sent a message asking to see him, and he arrived just after dusk. The lamplight made his features look older, more drawn. You wanted to see me, Miss Marple? Yes, she said softly, motioning him to sit. I'm afraid I must trouble you with unpleasant matters. The inspector found a note, rather a cryptic one, suggesting that Dr. March's death was not the end of things. It was written in a distinctly continental hand, French, if I'm not mistaken. The vicar's face tightened, just perceptibly. How extraordinary. And yet, I can't imagine what it could mean. Oh, I think you can, Miss Marple replied gently. I've often noticed that your sermons, while inspired, occasionally draw upon themes of confession and silence with uncommon conviction. You see, the doctor was not the only one offering counsel to the villagers. You did so too from the pulpit. But unlike him, you had no need to record what was told to you. You could destroy evidence by simply preaching forgiveness. His breath caught. You are accusing me, not of murder, she said calmly, but of complicity. You knew the doctor was blackmailing certain parishioners. You may even have warned him that his writings would one day be his undoing. When he ignored you, you ensured the truth would die with him. And when Mrs. Temple fell, you saw fit to protect your flock by ensuring no further scandal escaped. You hid the box, didn't you? The vicar's silence was answer enough. His shoulders sagged. I thought I was preserving the parish, he said hoarsely. Do you know what ruin it would have brought? He had letters, proofs, things that would have destroyed lives. I thought it best to let the dead bury the dead. Miss Marple's voice was soft but merciless. The dead, my dear Reverend, have never been very good at burying themselves. It always falls to the living to do so, and they rarely do it cleanly. The next morning, Reeves returned once more. He found her alone, the vicar already having left town quietly in the night, his resignation waiting on the bishop's desk. Reeves sighed. So it was him, then. Not the hand that killed, but the hand that concealed. The most dangerous hands are often folded in prayer, Inspector. Outside, the first sunlight touched the village roofs and the bell of street. Mary Mead rang again, clear, familiar, and somehow changed. It was no longer tolling for the dead, but for the living who must learn to speak again. The days that followed were quiet in street. Mary Mead. As if the village itself were exhaling after holding its breath too long. Life resumed its familiar rhythm, the baker's bell at dawn, the church clock chiming the hours, and the faint murmur of gossip returning like the tide after a storm. Yet beneath that surface calm lay a strange kind of reverence, the hush that settles over a place that has looked too long into its own reflection and found something it would rather forget. Miss Marple sat by her window each morning, knitting with unhurried precision, her sharp eyes softened by the return of peace but not dulled by it. Inspector Reeves stopped by one last time before leaving for London. He carried himself with the tired satisfaction of a man who had seen justice served, though he knew it had come not from the law's clean hand, but from the quiet work of truth, making its own way through shadow. "I thought I'd bring you the final report," he said, setting the folder on her table. "All signed, sealed, and sent to the Chief Constable. Officially, the deaths of Dr. March, Mrs. Temple, and Mrs. Clement are considered closed. The vicar's resignation has been accepted without inquiry. The papers will say little more than a tragic chain of events." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is how truth is usually filed, Inspector, under tragedy, to make it sound less like a choice." Reeves gave a short laugh, though there was no amusement in it. "And the vicar? I suppose he'll go abroad again. France, perhaps. A quiet posting. Somewhere no one asks too many questions. He will carry his penance with him," Miss Marple said softly. "Far more effective than exile. A man who silenced others must now live with his own silence. It is a just punishment." Reeves nodded slowly, then added, "And the village? You don't think there'll be more of this sort of thing?" "Oh, my dear Inspector," she said, her tone touched with fond irony. "There is always more of this sort of thing. Human nature doesn't vanish because the papers close a case. People will still whisper, still judge, still lie for the smallest of reasons. Love, envy, shame. It's the same poison, only in smaller doses." He hesitated at the door, then turned back. "If I may ask, did you ever truly believe Mrs. Temple intended to kill the doctor?" Miss Marple looked out the window, where the faint mist curled over the churchyard. "No. She wanted to frighten him, to remind him of the power he had taken from others. But once fear begins, it rarely obeys its master. That cup of tea passed through too many hands, each thinking they could control what it carried. And so it fulfilled every wish at once. Fear, silence, revenge." Reeves studied her for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You make it sound almost poetic." "It usually is," she replied. "Murder is only ever human nature expressed too plainly." When he had gone, Miss Marple returned to her armchair, her knitting lying idle in her lap. She thought of Dr. Leonard March, brilliant, confident, and fatally convinced that he could cure sin by diagnosing it. She thought of Mrs. Temple, whose charm had become her weapon, and of poor Mrs. Clement, crushed beneath the weight of other people's secrets. And she thought, too, of the vicar, who had tried to preserve his flock by hiding its sickness, only to become infected by the very quiet he worshipped. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the leaves along the lane. The chemist's shop had reopened under new management. The church bell rang again, steady and untroubled, and the roses in Miss Marple's garden had begun their late bloom, tender and defiant against the coming frost. The village, in its way, was healing not from the deaths, but from the illusions that had birthed them. That evening, she walked slowly to the churchyard. The air was cool, the world wrapped in a soft, golden dusk. She paused by the small stone where Dr. March's name had been freshly carved. Someone had placed a single white lily there, no name, no note. Miss Marple stood a moment, the faint rustle of her skirt the only sound. "Poor man," she said quietly. "He prescribed silence and received it in abundance. Perhaps now, at last, he understands that healing requires confession, not concealment." The wind rose slightly, carrying the chime of the church bell across the graves. She turned back toward the path, her steps unhurried, her expression serene. Behind her, the light faded over the stone walls. And Mary Mead settled into the soft twilight of forgiveness, the kind that never quite erases, but gently forgets. Back in her cottage, she lit her lamp and picked up her knitting once more. The click of the needles filled the small room like a heartbeat. Another case, another lesson in human frailty, tucked away with quiet understanding. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window, where the night pressed against the glass, deep and still. "We are such delicate creatures," she murmured to herself, pretending strength while craving mercy. "In the end, it is not sin that destroys us, but the effort to hide it." She smiled then, that small, wise smile that seemed to belong to all the women who had ever seen too much and forgiven too often. The fire crackled softly, the clock chimed the hour, and somewhere in the distance the church bell answered one final, gentle note to mark the close of Mary Mead's dark chapter. Outside, the stars gathered above the quiet village, serene and watchful, while within the small cottage on the lane, Jane Marple continued her knitting, steady, thoughtful, and at peace with the world she understood so well. The end.